Imagine this. A late afternoon in the heart of the 17th century, within the cold, imposing walls of Spain's El Escorial Palace. The air is thick with the scent of old stone and incense, heavy with the weight of an empire at its zenith. But in this room, there is no sense of glory, only a profound and unsettling silence. A young boy stands alone before a vast, ornate mirror. He is not admiring his reflection. He is struggling with it. He tries to close his mouth, a simple act for any other child, but his jaw refuses to obey. It juts forward, long and heavy, locking his face in what looks like a permanent expression of sorrow. This is Charles II, King of Spain, and he is a prisoner in his own body. He touches his chin, the infamous Habsburg jaw, feeling the familiar alien shape of his own bones. The question that hangs in the still air is not who he is, but why. Why does a king, born to inherit the world, look so broken? To understand Charles, you must walk the halls of his palace, where the past is not dead, it is watching. The walls are lined with portraits of his ancestors, a gallery of ghosts, stretching back for generations. Their stern, painted eyes follow you, and as you look closer, a chilling pattern emerges. From emperor to archduke, from queen to infanta, they all share his burden. The same long face, the same heavy jaw, the same full lower lip. These are the Habsburgs, a dynasty so obsessed with preserving its power that it turned its own family tree into a cage. Their motto was, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." But their marriages were not alliances with outsiders. They were pacts made with themselves. Uncle married niece. First cousin married first cousin. Over and over, until the bloodline no longer branched out, but coiled back on itself, like a serpent devouring its own tail. Charles was the final, tragic product of this strategy. His genetic makeup was a labyrinth. His mother was his father's niece. His grandmother was also his aunt. The inbreeding was so extreme that his genetic code was more scrambled than that of a child born to a brother and sister. He was born a king, but nature had already passed its sentence. He grew up frail, epileptic, and perpetually ill. He struggled to walk, to speak, to eat. The immense pressure of the Spanish crown rested on his fragile shoulders, and with it, a single desperate command: produce an heir. The survival of the dynasty, the stability of Europe, depended on it. Yet his two marriages, both politically arranged and deeply unhappy, produced no children. He was the king of a global empire, yet he was impotent, a symbol of a bloodline that had finally exhausted itself. The end came in the year 1700. Charles was just 38, but he looked like an ancient, decrepit man. His death was not a peaceful release. It was a final, horrific spectacle. The autopsy performed on his body revealed a truth more shocking than any rumor. The physician's report reads like a catalog from a horror story. His heart, the doctor wrote, was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs corroded, his intestines rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, black as coal, and his head was full of water. It was as if his body had simply given up, rotted from the inside out by the genetic poison that had flowed through his family's veins for centuries. The death of Charles the Bewitched, as he came to be known, was not merely the end of a man. It was the death of a dynasty. With no heir, the Spanish throne was up for grabs, plunging Europe into the devastating War of the Spanish Succession. The Habsburgs had traded genetic health for political power, and in the end, they lost both. Their story is a chilling testament to how a body can be broken by its own blood. But physical decay was only one part of this terrible price. As we will see, some royal houses found that the most terrifying prison was not the body, but the mind itself. The physical collapse of the Habsburg dynasty serves as a stark warning, a grotesque monument to the dangers of a closed bloodline. But the body is not the only vessel that can be broken by this legacy. Sometimes the damage is invisible, a decay that consumes not the organs, but the soul. Let us travel forward a century, to the late 1700s, to the Queluz Palace in Portugal, often called the Portuguese Versailles. On a still, moonlit night, the lavish gardens and gilded halls are shrouded in silence. And then, it comes. A scream. It is not a cry of physical pain, but a sound of pure, undiluted terror, erupting from the royal apartments. It is a wail of a mind that has come undone, a soul lost in its own private hell. The guards outside the door do not move. The ladies in waiting bow their heads and whisper a prayer. They have heard this sound before. It is the voice of their queen, Maria I, and she is descending into madness. What could drive a monarch, once celebrated for her wisdom and piety, to such a state? To understand Maria's tragedy, we must look at the same familiar pattern. Born in 1734, she was a product of the intricate web of Iberian royal marriages. But the decisive act of her life came when she was pressured to secure the throne and the Braganza dynasty. To do this, she married her own uncle Peter. For the court, it was a sound political move. For Maria, a deeply devout Catholic, it was a sin that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She was trapped between her duty to the crown and her duty to God, and the conflict would eventually tear her mind apart. In her early reign, she was known as Maria the Pious, a ruler who championed arts and culture. But shadows were gathering. Her family life was a litany of sorrow. Half of her children died in infancy, a grim echo of the Habsburg curse. Then, in 1786, her husband, her uncle, died. 2 years later, her eldest son and heir succumbed to smallpox. For Maria, these were not mere tragedies. They were divine punishments. She became convinced that God was chastising her for her incestuous marriage. Her deep piety curdled into terrifying religious paranoia. She began to see visions of her deceased father engulfed in flames, tortured for his sins. The devil, she claimed, was whispering to her from the walls, tormenting her with visions of eternal damnation. The court tried desperately to manage the situation. They brought in the most famous doctor in Europe, who prescribed brutal treatments like daily ice baths and bloodletting, which only worsened her terror. Her public appearances became rare. Her lucid moments grew fewer and farther between. The business of the state was carried on by her son, but the throne was still occupied by a queen lost in a labyrinth of fear and guilt. The final, heartbreaking chapter of her life came in 1807. As Napoleon's armies marched on Lisbon, the entire Portuguese royal family was forced to flee, to embark on a perilous journey across the Atlantic to their colony of Brazil. Maria, now completely detached from reality, was carried onto the ship. Imagine the scene. A queen, the sovereign of 2 continents, huddled in her cabin, screaming at phantoms that only she could see. She was no longer a ruler, she was a passenger, a piece of royal luggage being transported to safety. She would live out the rest of her days in a convent in Rio de Janeiro, a mad queen in a tropical exile, a living ghost haunted by the belief that her own blood had damned her soul. Maria's story shows us a different kind of horror, not the slow, physical decay of a king, but the terrifying implosion of a mind. But for some dynasties, this genetic gamble was not seen as a curse to be feared, but as a deliberate, ruthless strategy for absolute power. We have seen the body broken and the mind shattered. We have seen these consequences as tragic flaws, as curses that brought down mighty houses. But what if the strategy was the point? What if the horrors of inbreeding were not an unforeseen consequence, but a calculated cost, willingly paid in the pursuit of something believed to be even more valuable? Divine purity and absolute power. To understand this, we must leave Europe behind and journey back in time to the banks of the Nile, to the dazzling, dangerous world of Ptolemaic Egypt. Here, a royal wedding is taking place. The bride and groom are radiant, adorned in gold and jewels. They are also brother and sister. And to everyone watching, From the highest priest to the common citizen, this is not a taboo, it is a sacred duty. This was the way of the Ptolemies. Though they ruled Egypt, they were not Egyptian. They were a Greek Macedonian dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. They were foreign rulers in a foreign land, a tiny island of Hellenic blood in a vast Egyptian sea. To protect their identity and their claim to the throne, they adopted a ruthless strategy. They would keep the bloodline pure. They locked their family tree in a genetic fortress, marrying brother to sister, uncle to niece, for nearly 300 years. Their family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a closed loop, a perfect circle designed to concentrate power. And at the very center of this vortex of power and blood was a woman named Cleopatra. Not the famous Cleopatra VII who captivated Rome, but her ancestor, Cleopatra II, Philopator. If Charles II was the end product of a tragic mistake, Cleopatra II was the perfected instrument of a deliberate policy. She was the living embodiment of the Ptolemaic obsession. Her parents were brother and sister. Her grandparents were also siblings. Her life was a masterclass in dynastic survival. She married her own brother, Ptolemy VI, and ruled alongside him. After his death, she married her other brother, Ptolemy VIII, a cruel and obese man nicknamed Potbelly. Their world was not governed by love or affection, but by a cold, brutal calculus of power. In the world of the Ptolemies, your closest relative was also your deadliest rival. Cleopatra II's life was a constant, violent struggle for the throne against the very men who were her brothers and husbands. She raised armies against them, plotted against them, and was exiled by them, only to fight her way back to power. The Palace of Alexandria was a snake pit, where trust was a fatal weakness and murder was a tool of statecraft. The titles of sister, wife, brother, and husband became blurred, losing all meaning in a relentless quest for solitary rule. Here, we see the ultimate paradox, the fatal flaw in the Ptolemies' grand design. The strategy of inbreeding, intended to consolidate power and eliminate external threats, ended up creating the most dangerous threats of all, internal ones. The dynasty was not brought down by foreign invaders or popular revolt. It was hollowed out from within by generations of fratricide, civil war, and endless infighting between family members who were too closely related and too hungry for power. By the time the final Cleopatra, the famous one, came to the throne, the dynasty was a shadow of its former self, weakened and unstable, ripe for the taking. Rome did not conquer a mighty empire. It simply swept away the pieces of a house that had already destroyed itself. The Ptolemies thought they were creating gods. Instead, they bred their own executioners. Their story begs the question: if this was the price of power in ancient empires, have we, in our modern world, truly learned the lesson? Surely, such practices are relics of a distant, brutal past. Or are they? The tales of the Habsburgs and Ptolemies feel like dark fairy tales, stories of kings and queens in faraway lands, separated from us by a chasm of centuries. It is easy to look at their twisted family trees and think, this is history. This is not our world. But the chilling truth is that the genetic ghosts of the past do not stay in the past. Sometimes they reappear, not in palaces, but in the forgotten corners of our own time. Our journey now takes us to a place far from any throne room, a squalid, isolated settlement in rural Australia in the early 2000s. In the dirt yard of a makeshift dwelling, a small child plays silently. There is no crown on this child's head, no silk on their back. But look closely at their face and you might see it, a haunting echo of the past. A facial structure that speaks of a lineage turned inward, a story all too familiar. This is not the 17th century. There is no political power at stake. So what is happening here? This is the story of the Colt family, a pseudonym given to protect their identities, but their reality is one of the most shocking cases of multi-generational inbreeding in modern history. For 4 generations, this family lived in almost complete isolation, a secluded clan hidden away from the eyes of the world. Here, the unspeakable became the normal. Relationships between brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters, uncles and nieces, were not just secrets, they were the very fabric of their community. They were not preserving a royal bloodline. They were trapped in a cycle of poverty, ignorance, and secrecy, creating a genetic prison from which there was no escape. The outside world knew nothing until social workers and police, acting on a tip, stumbled into their world. What they found was a human tragedy on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. They uncovered a genealogical web so tangled and complex that it defied a traditional family tree. The children, born from these unions, bore the heavy, predictable price. Many suffered from profound physical disabilities and severe intellectual impairments. They were the silent victims of a legacy they could not understand. The details that emerged were heartbreaking. One investigator recounted a conversation that exposed the depth of the confusion. "We asked a young girl to point to her mother, and she did. Then we asked her to point to her grandmother. She pointed to the same woman." In this closed world, the fundamental roles of a family had dissolved into a nightmare. This was not a story about ambition or dynastic pride. It was a story about vulnerability, about what happens when people fall through the cracks of society.
When the case became public, it sent shockwaves across Australia and beyond.
It was a visceral, modern-day reminder that the consequences of inbreeding are not a historical curiosity. They are a devastating human reality. The ensuing investigation led to arrests and legal proceedings, but the questions it raised were much bigger than the crimes of a few individuals. Who was truly to blame? How could a situation like this develop, unchecked, for decades? The monster in this story was not a single person. It was the crushing weight of isolation. It was the silence of a community. It was the failure of a system to protect its most vulnerable members. The story of the Colt family is a brutal slap of reality, proving that this is not just history. It is a pressing, painful, human issue. From this extreme case of modern isolation, our final chapter turns to a very different kind of story, one that brings the dilemma into the heart of one of the most brilliant minds the world has ever known. We have journeyed through palaces of stone and prisons of the mind. We have seen how power, religion, and isolation can drive families to twist their own bloodlines, often with devastating results. It seems a simple equation. Inbreeding leads to tragedy. But our final story is not simple at all. It is a story of profound conflict, a paradox that lived at the very center of a man who, more than anyone, understood the laws of nature. This is the story of Charles Darwin. Picture him in his study at Down House. He is surrounded by the evidence he has painstakingly collected from around the world. On his desk are notes about his pigeons. He has observed them for years, meticulously breeding them, documenting how traits are passed down. He sees with his own scientific eyes that when he breeds closely related birds, the offspring are often frail, sickly, and infertile. He is unlocking the very secrets of heredity, the foundational principles of what we now call genetics. Then, he puts down his pen, leaves his study, and walks into the drawing room to join his wife, Emma. He loves her dearly. She is his partner, his confidant, the anchor of his life. She is also his first cousin. Here lies the great paradox. How could the man who was formulating the theory of evolution, a man so keenly aware of the dangers of a limited gene pool, make a choice for himself and his family that seemed to fly in the face of his own discoveries? The answer is not one of scientific failure, but of human complexity. His marriage to Emma Wedgwood was not a political arrangement or an act of isolated ignorance. It was common practice among the English upper class, a way to keep wealth and status within a tight circle. And their marriage was, by all accounts, a deep and loving one. Their home was filled with laughter, intellectual debate, and the joy of 10 children. But a persistent shadow hung over the Darwin household, the shadow of illness. Their family life was a constant battle against sickness. 3 of their 10 children died in childhood. Others were plagued by chronic ailments for their entire lives. Darwin himself suffered from mysterious, debilitating illnesses that baffled his doctors. And in the quiet moments, in the dead of night when another child was struck with a fever, a terrible question must have haunted him. A question that his own research made him uniquely qualified to ask. Was it his fault? Was his marriage to his beloved Emma the source of his family's suffering? The most devastating blow came with the death of their daughter Annie at the age of 10. Darwin adored her. Her death shattered him. It destroyed his remaining faith in a benevolent God and sent him deeper into his search for answers, not in prayer, but in the cold, hard facts of the natural world. He never explicitly wrote about his personal fears concerning his own marriage, but if you read his work with this tragedy in mind, you can feel it between the lines. When he writes with such force about the evil effects of close interbreeding, is he merely a detached scientist, or is he also a grieving father? His scientific conclusions feel like they are forged not only in observation but also in personal pain. His work becomes a kind of confession, a public exploration of a private agony. In the end, Charles Darwin's story brings our journey full circle. It shows us that this issue is not confined to the cruel or the ignorant. It touched kings and commoners, the mad and the brilliant. It reveals that no amount of power, faith, or even scientific genius can offer an escape from the fundamental laws of biology. From the gilded cage of the Habsburgs to the tragic isolation of the Colts, and finally to the quiet study of a revolutionary scientist, we see that history is not only written in the annals of war and politics, it is written in our blood. It is shaped by the invisible, inescapable hand of our own lineage, a force that can bestow the glories of a crown or the burden of a curse, often at the very same time.